Welcome to Mini Story Day of the Dead. In Mini Story Day of the Dead, AJ will do 3 things. AJ make a statement. For example, I arrive in Guatemala. When I hear a statement, a sentence, I just say or. I and you need to say that. So that's understand. This is not question. This is a statement, a sentence, not question. For example, AJ say, I arrive in Guatemala. I say, The second thing, AJ will do yes question. I know the question. I know the answer. For example, where do I arrive? Where do I arrive? AJ stop. I say the answer. I say the answer. I and you must answer every question. For example, AJ said, I arrived in Guatemala. Where did I arrive? I said, Guatemala. Very easy. The third thing, AJ will do yes question. I don't know the answer. I can guess. Yes, but I and you must every question. Now let's begin. AJ make a sentence, a statement, and make many questions. I answer. Okay.
On the Day of the Dead. Well, me, AJ, right? I arrived in Guatemala on the Day of the Dead, November 1st. Did I arrive in Guatemala? Where did I arrive? Okay, let's begin. Okay, here we go. I arrived in Guatemala on the Day of the Dead, November 1st. Did I arrive in Guatemala?
AJ.
Yes,
AJ
I arrived in Guatemala. Where did I arrive?
Guatemala. I arrived in Guatemala.
I arrived in Guatemala. I arrived in Guatemala on the Day of the Dead, November 1st. Who arrived in Guatemala on the Day of the Dead?
AJ. I arrived
AJ.
in Guatemala.
I arrived in Guatemala
on the Day of the Dead, November 1st.
November 1st. Did I arrive in Guatemala on November 3rd?
No, I arrived in Guatemala on the Day of the Dead, November 1st.
3rd. I arrived in Guatemala on November 1st. What day did I arrive in Guatemala?
November 1st.
November 1st. I arrived in Guatemala on
1st.
November 1st. Where did I arrive on
Guatemala.
November 1st?
Guatemala. I arrived in Guatemala.
Well, Guatemala, right? I arrived in Guatemala on November 1st. I arrived in Guatemala on the Day of the Dead, November 1st. I was curious about this holiday. So
Oh.
I went to the cemetery to
Oh.
see what was happening. Was I angry about this holiday?
No, I'm curious
No,
about
no,
this
I
holiday.
wasn't angry about this holiday. Was I sad about this holiday?
No, I'm not sad about
No,
this
no,
holiday.
I wasn't sad about this
Wasn't
holiday.
sad
I
about
was
this holiday.
curious about this holiday. Who was curious about this holiday?
I was
Well, I was, AJ.
curious.
I was curious about this holiday. What was I curious about?
Holiday.
The holiday.
I was
curious about
this
the
holiday.
holiday. Which holiday was I curious about?
This holiday.
Which holiday was I
This-
curious
this-
about?
Holiday.
The Day of the Dead. I was curious about the Day of
The Day
the Dead.
of the Dead.
Was I curious about the Day of the
Dead.
Dead? Or was I curious about Christmas?
No.
No, I was curious about the
the
Day of the Dead,
Dead.
of course.
Holiday.
I was curious about the Day of the Dead. So I went to the cemetery to see what was happening. Where did I go?
Guatemala.
To the cemetery.
Cemetery.
I went
Cemetery.
to the cemetery. Did I go to the cemetery or did I go to the airport?
I went to the cemetery.
Yeah, I went to the cemetery. Who went to the cemetery?
I, AJ, went to the
Me
cemetery.
and AJ. I went to the cemetery. Where did I go?
Cemetery.
To the cemetery, right. I went to the cemetery. When did I go to the cemetery?
November 1st.
Oh, November 1st, the Day of the Dead, right? I went to the cemetery on the Day of the Dead, November 1st. Why did I go to the cemetery?
I went to the cemetery to see what's happening.
Well, to see what was happening.
What was happening.
I went to the cemetery to
to
see
what
was happening. Who went to the cemetery to see what was happening?
I went to the cemetery
Me,
to see
AJ,
what was
went
happening.
to the cemetery to see what was happening. Where was the cemetery?
Guatemala.
In
Cemetery
Guatemala.
was
The cemetery was in
Guatemala.
Guatemala. What is the Day of the Dead? A holiday. The
holiday.
Day of the Dead
is
a holiday.
holiday.
When is the Day of the Dead?
November 1st.
November 1st. The Day of the Dead
is on
was
was
and
on
is November
November 1st.
1st. Okay. So I went to the cemetery on the Day of the Dead to see what was happening. What I found was quite interesting.
Oh,
Was it boring? No,
no,
it wasn't boring.
Interesting.
Was it interesting?
Yes.
Yes, yes. It
Yes.
was interesting. The
It's
cemetery was
interesting.
interesting. How did I feel about the cemetery?
Interesting.
I felt it was interesting. Or I thought it was interesting. Was it boring or was it interesting?
It was interesting.
It was interesting. Of course, it was interesting. What was interesting? The cemetery.
The cemetery was interesting.
Interesting. When was the cemetery interesting? It was interesting on the Day of the Dead, November 1st. Okay, the atmosphere in the cemetery was like a party.
Oh.
Was the atmosphere very sad?
No, the atmosphere is like
the atmosphere was
party.
not sad. The atmosphere was like a party.
Was like a party.
The atmosphere was very happy.
No.
Was the atmosphere sad or happy?
Happy.
The atmosphere was happy. The atmosphere was like a party.
Was like a party.
What was like a party?
The atmosphere was like a party.
The atmosphere in the cemetery was like a party. Where was the atmosphere like a party?
In the cemetery.
In the cemetery. The cemetery. The atmosphere was like a party
in the
cemetery. Was the atmosphere like a party at my house?
No.
No.
In cemetery.
No, not at my house. The atmosphere was like a party in the cemetery. The atmosphere was not like a party in my house. So the atmosphere was like a party. There were people everywhere.
Oh.
Families were sitting around the graves of their dead ancestors.
Oh.
Where were the families sitting? Around the graves.
Around the graves.
They were sitting around the graves. Who was sitting around the graves?
Families.
The families, right? The families were sitting around the graves. Were they sitting around the trees?
No, the graves.
No, they weren't sitting around the trees. They were sitting around the graves. So, where were they sitting? Around the graves.
Around the graves.
Families were sitting around the graves of their dead ancestors. Were they sitting around the graves of their dead ancestors?
Yes.
Yes. They were sitting
around the graves of their dead ancestors.
Were they sitting around the graves of their friends?
No. They were sitting around
They were sitting around the graves of their dead ancestors. Who was sitting around the graves?
Families were sitting around of the death of the graves ancestors.
Graves were they sitting around? Whose graves were they sitting around?
Of the dead.
Yes, their dead ancestors. Their ancestors. Their ancestors' graves. They were sitting around the graves of their dead ancestors.